Today I wanted to talk about a unique topic that has not actually ever been addressed in any of the conferences or any of the discussions on the low carb forums or the low carb sites. And it relates in many ways to fasting and low carb diets, movement or exercise, and sleep. And that is called calorie restriction. So what does calorie restriction actually mean? And what my objectives for today's presentation are. So my objectives are to define what calorie restriction is, go through how we know it is helpful for us based on animal studies, based on human data. We're going to define the biology of hunger. I mean, how do you control hunger? What are the factors that make us hungry? And then finally, any presentation I give, I want to make it practical for you. I want to make it so that you are able to practice calorie restriction by methods and techniques that I'm going to explain to you about. Now, at the outset, I want to say that intermittent fasting does not contradict with calorie restriction, because when you do intermittent fasting, in some ways you're practicing calorie restriction, because intermittent fasting reduces the size of the stomach. It gives you better control of a hunger hormone called ghrelin. We'll explore that further. The reduction in insulin levels makes you eat less. And there is better functioning of a satiety hormone called leptin. Now, up until recently, I've been fairly successful in getting people to reduce their weight, reduce their insulin resistance, and they have improved their health. However, there is a substantial proportion of patients, like for example, I was talking to the daughter of one of my colleagues, and she's been doing intermittent fasting, she's been doing a low carb diet, and yet not losing weight. Perhaps the tool that she's lacking is calorie restriction. And the way I define that is that humans are designed to overeat. The Paleolithic humans before us, before modern humans, had to hunt for food. Food was not consistently available, so they went through periods of involuntary fasting on a regular basis. And in order to protect us from famine, our biology is designed to overeat when food is available. What was helpful to us in the Paleolithic times is hurting us because modern humans have mastered agriculture. There is availability of food. There is a refrigerator in your home. So your Paleolithic instincts, your human instincts, have not evolved to deal with this food availability. And that's the reason why overeating and obesity is so common. In addition, food manufacturers have engineered our food. They have made the food such that we would overeat. If you take a bag of chips, the hotness index, the spicy index of that chip varies from chip to chip with a specific purpose that is designed to make you overeat because they profit from that. So what is the animal data on calorie restriction? Now, this is a study in mice. So this study in mice, a group of mice were taken. And if you look at the top line, and here is my arrow, this group of mice were fed ad libitum. That means that they were given as much food as they wanted. The next group below them, they were given about 20% less calories. So their calorie restriction was by 20%. The third group, which we will just take as the 40 kilocalories per week, they reduced their calories by about 65%. The ad lib mouse, they are heavier. They almost reach about 50 grams. With 20% less calories, they are around 35 grams. With 65% less calories, they're about 18 to 20 grams. So that is their weight. But how long did each of this group live when calories were restricted? So what has shown that when you restrict calories in mice, not only do you increase their average lifespan, but you increase their maximum lifespan. Let's show that a little bit more clearly. So these are the group of mice that were fed ad libitum, however much they wanted. They all died at 35 months. The group that was restricted by 20% lived about 7 months longer. But look what's happening to the group that were restricted by 65%. They lived up till 55 months, 20 months longer. So what I wanted to tell you is that it prolonged the life of these mice by almost 65%. So people will say, mice are not human-like, the information in mice is not useful. So this is information from the Wisconsin Primate Research Center. They have rhesus monkeys, rhesus macaque monkeys from India. And they did calorie restriction experiments in monkeys. They took about 76 monkeys, 38, they studied their feeding behavior. In fact, they studied the feeding behavior of all 76 animals before and saw how much they were eating. In the 38 that they utilized for ad libitum group, which meant that they ate as much as they were eating before, the other 38, their calories were restricted by about 30%. Now, monkeys in captivity live for between 28 to 40 years. So this study was not a short duration study. This study was carried out for 20 years of follow-up. A typical pharmaceutical trial is only lasting about 1 to 5 years. So this duration of follow-up is humongous. These monkeys are not fed the diet like we advocate from the fasting method or any low-carb community. These animals were given the same junk food that Americans eat, which is written as the standard American diet. They were given some protein in the form of lactalbumin, but there was a lot of sugar and corn oil, vegetable oil, which is not bad, which is very bad for us. The control diet had more calories. The restricted diet had fewer calories. They were reduced by the same percentage, but an important aspect of both rat as well as the rhesus monkey studies is that malnutrition was avoided by giving them important vitamins and minerals. The animals were recruited in 3 different phases. The first phase, this was because of funding. There was a period 1 in which they enrolled about 30 animals. Then another time they enrolled 30 animals that were mostly females, and then they enrolled another 8. So they ended up with at least 15 females in the ad libitum group and 15 females in the group that were calorie restricted. Now, as I said, this study was carried out for 20 years. There was an interim analysis at about 8 years in 2000. And this paper was published. And in the interim analysis, they looked at the difference in weight between the group that was given as much food as they wanted versus calorie restricted. So this group, which was given as much food as they wanted, was heavier. The calorie restricted group was lighter. This was the second enrollment period. Within 24 months, these curves started separating. The Ad libitum group were heavier, the calorie restricted groups were lighter, quite significantly in all three groups. What happened to their fat mass? So this is total and regional fat mass. In the control group, the fat mass was much higher compared to the group that had undergone dietary restriction or calorie restriction. It was lower not only in the abdomen, but in all places. So these animals were lighter. Now, one of the surrogate markers of better health is blood sugar levels and insulin levels. If you looked at blood sugar levels, the blood sugar levels were lower in the animals that were calorie restricted. Insulin level was significantly lower. This is the first group. These were the second two groups that were enrolled, blood sugar levels being low in the calorie restricted group compared to the control groups, insulin levels being low. Leptin is an important hormone that is elaborated by the fat cells. If your fat cells increase in size and number, less leptin is made. So the control group that had a lot more fat, I guess I'm saying that the opposite way. When you have a lot of fat, a lot more leptin is made, and the leptin was higher. When your fat mass is lower, less leptin is made. However, as you become heavy and if you have higher insulin, the brain does not see leptin and you are leptin resistant and you don't get the same satiety signals. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, in this rhesus monkey study, there was a 20-year follow-up. Their diet was controlled for 2 decades. So in other words, in this experimental program, they could exactly determine how much food we gave to these monkeys. It's not like a human trial in which we cannot control these factors. The Wisconsin Primate Research Center is a high-quality facility. These animals were monitored every day. Their death rate was precisely assessed. And chronic diseases, unfortunately, rhesus monkeys have the same chronic problems, chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, cancers, and brain atrophy like humans do. Now, at the end of 20 years, this is a representative sample of a monkey that was fed ad libitum versus calorie restriction. You can clearly see that this monkey looks a lot older. You can see that this posture is that of an older person with significant degree of hair loss. This is a calorie restricted monkey. He looks younger in his face. His posture is better. The hair quality is better. But I guess you guys don't care about all of this. What you want to know is that did they live longer? And if you looked at age-related mortality, not mortality that was as a result of injury or surgeries, this is in blue, the monkeys that were fed as much food as they wanted. 50% of them were dead by about 20 years of follow-up. On the other hand, in red are the calorie-restricted monkeys. At 20 years of follow-up, 80% of them were alive. So at any given time, the calorie restricted monkeys had a 3-fold higher chance of living compared to the monkeys that were fed as much food as they wanted. Like we discussed, monkeys also die of cancers, heart disease, and diabetes. If again you looked at this graph and you looked at the calorie restricted monkeys, they had a much lower chance of getting these chronic diseases, of acquiring these chronic diseases compared to the monkeys that were in the control group. In fact, almost all the monkeys in the control group got some kind of a chronic disease or another, whereas nearly 70% of monkeys in the calorie restricted group were free of chronic diseases. Now, I want to give you a little balance from the rhesus monkey studies, because there was another group at the National Institute of Aging that did a similar study. Now, I don't want to go into details because I want to spend time with what I think is important. But in the NIA study, there was a significant reduction in chronic diseases, and there was the same direction in terms of reducing mortality, but it didn't reach statistical significance. And there are differences in which the NIA designed their studies versus the University of Wisconsin designed their studies. And I think those are really the reasons why it is responsible for differences in outcome. And for people who are more interested, I'm writing a paper, and I will show you the paper here. This is the paper, and it is an exhaustive document with references. And Melissa is going to post it. It's going to be posted on the website of IDM and the fasting method. So you will have access to it. So that's why I wanted to show you that a paper has already been written that will get posted. So you would say monkeys are still not humans. What is the human data? So I want to take you through what we know. During World War II, there were several European countries that restricted food intake of their population. One of the countries was Norway. In Oslo, Norway, they said, we're going to do 20% calorie reduction for you because it's wartime, Second World War, we can't feed you. But they said that we're going to try to provide you with balanced food. They gave them fresh vegetables, potatoes, fish, whole cereal. Still not the best diet that I would recommend, but there was enough variety. And that was to prevent malnutrition. It was undernutrition, but not malnutrition. When compared to pre-war levels in both men and women, there was a 30% reduction in mortality. Many of us have heard about the Okinawa effect. Okinawa is an island in Japan where it was found on a research survey that these Okinawans ate about 17% less food than mainland Japanese and roughly about 40% less compared to the Americans. And when you looked at the lifespan, the average lifespan and the maximum lifespan, the Okinawans had about a 4 to 5 fold better chance than, let's say, the United States or the United Kingdom of reaching 100 years of age. Their average lifespan was increased by about 2 years, and their maximum lifespan was extended by 4 years. So there is some evidence based on demographic studies that calorie restriction is beneficial. But you will say, hey, is there any randomized trial in humans? Have you taken a group of humans and you mashed them before, and to half of them you gave them less calories and the other half you said feed ad libitum, however much you wanted? So my response to that is that is difficult. The reason it is difficult is because to get an outcomes data like death rate or mortality, you would need about 30 years of observation. It would also be impossible to be certain that these humans are doing calorie restriction and impose it on them for that many years. On the other hand, you can do short-term studies in which you get surrogate markers of health, like weight, like metabolic rate, like energy expenditure. I will define that further like insulin levels, triglycerides, and blood pressure. So a study like this was done. They enrolled about 218 patients. About 117 completed the study in the group that were calorie restricted. They were divided a little differently. In other words, 145 were in the group initially, 75 were there in the other group. Of the 145, 117 agreed to do the intervention. Of the 75, 71 were able to complete. So let's see what happened to these individuals. So now here we are looking on this graph, the amount of calorie restriction. How good were they at restricting calories over time? In the first 6 months, they were able to do 20% calorie restriction that was advised. But the amount of calorie restriction between 6 to 12, 12 to 18, and 18 to 24 months declined. So on an average, they restricted 10% of their calories over 2 years. What happened to their weight? This is weight loss over time. This is the unrestricted group. This is the restricted group. They lost an average of 8 kilograms. That's roughly about 20 pounds. It's impressive. Now, let me tell you what metabolic rate is. Metabolic rate is when we take fuel and burn it for energy. So that is the oxidative phosphorylation, big term. But basically, when you are burning fuel for energy, you create a little bit of burn injury. That's called oxidative injury. So higher your metabolic rate, perhaps faster you're aging because you're creating more free radicals that will cause you to age. So a reduction in your metabolic rate, a reduction in your total daily energy expenditure could be a marker that you are aging at a lower rate. And with calorie restriction, you found that the resting metabolic rate as well as total daily energy expenditure got reduced. Now, we already know that insulin is a surrogate marker of health. Less insulin, more effective insulin works, the better the health is. And HOMA-IR is a marker of how well your insulin is working. Lower is better. So the HOMA-IR fell in these humans that were calorie restricted compared to not calorie restricted at both 12 and 24 months. Their blood pressure declined. Their blood pressure declined significantly, which is another marker of health. Now, the slide got a little bit out of place, but here is the slide. Now, another good marker of health are triglycerides. Triglycerides is fat and blood. Having less amount of fat and blood is useful for us. And with calorie restriction, the triglycerides dropped significantly. Now, there was not a significant change in their cholesterol levels. In fact, the cholesterol levels dropped significantly, but I'm not sure that this is such a beneficial aspect. And I think this happened mostly because of the type of diet that these people were eating. So I want to move on from calorie restriction now. So I have shown you what calorie restriction is. But now I want to help you figure out why we feel hungry, because if you understand hunger, you will be able to restrict your calories. So let's take a look at what causes us to be hungry. Now, there are many factors, but one of the most important factors that makes us hungry is a hormone that gets released at the sight, smell, and thought of food, and that is ghrelin. So ghrelin is released by the stomach. It goes and acts in the brain and makes you eat. It starts your eating behavior. The ghrelin also is modulated to some degree by another nerve that is going from the stomach called the vagus nerve. We will not get into that. So let's see how ghrelin is released. So this is a person who's eating breakfast here, lunch here, and dinner here. At this time is midnight. So the thought of breakfast, the ghrelin starts going up pretty rapidly. It reaches its peak. But the most important thing I'm trying to make you aware of is that it takes about 60 minutes to an hour for this ghrelin to come down. And many people postulate that as the ghrelin goes up, so does insulin, and that rise of insulin is actually the stimulus that makes the ghrelin go away. I'd like to argue that there are other factors that can do that too. So the group took to try to figure out how powerful is ghrelin in making us eat. So they took 9 healthy individuals, they gave them ghrelin intravenously, and also at another time they gave them saline to see how much food they would eat when ghrelin was given and how much they would eat when saline was given. And these individuals were taken to a buffet lunch, and they found that they ate substantially more calories when they were given ghrelin. So here is the graph. The saline group ate this many kilocalories. The ghrelin group ate a lot more. Over a period of one day, they ate almost 550 more calories. Every single person who was given ghrelin compared to saline ate more. So it was not like ghrelin was making one person eat more and not another person eat more. They also looked at the visual interpretation of hunger by these people, looking at food. Who was more hungry? Looking at food before infusion, the hunger was the same. But after infusion, the hunger was a lot more. The perception, the thought of food and the hunger through visual cues was a lot more in people who were on ghrelin. Now here is an important aspect. When you fast, when you're doing fasting, our body is on a circadian rhythm cycle. It knows night and day. And what happens is that during fasting, even when you're not eating, at lunchtime, at dinner time, at breakfast time, the ghrelin levels are going up. This is the median, this is the top group, this is the bottom group in terms of ghrelin production. So if you look at an average, there are peaks at the time of lunch, dinner, and breakfast. There is a midnight peak also that is responsible for releasing growth hormone. So there are two important aspects about ghrelin and fasting. One is that ghrelin is still released when you're fasting. The second aspect is that the ghrelin is coming down on its own without an increase in insulin. So what does that tell you? What that tells you is that if you ignore ghrelin, if you cognitively say, hey, I'm fasting and I cannot have any food, if you ignore the stimulus to eat through cognitive control, the ghrelin will go down. The third important thing that this is showing you is that over a 24-hour period, the direction of ghrelin is coming lower. So in other words, with fasting, the hunger stimulus is declining, not continuously increasing. So before you go off and say, hey, I know how to master ghrelin, I want to share with you one other information. And that is, what do ghrelin levels do when you lose weight? Do they come up? Do they go down? So this group took a group of people who were overweight and heavy, and they did diet-induced weight loss, not the kind of diet we recommend, just calorie restriction. And then another group of people, to 5 of them, they did gastric bypass surgery and measured ghrelin levels. So let's see what happened. So this is the group with diet-induced weight loss. They lost their body weight substantially. This is in kilograms, which is a humongous amount, about 17 kilograms. They preserved their muscle mass because compared to their body weight, their non-fat mass increased, their abdominal fat dropped by almost 50%. Their insulin worked better, their blood pressures went down. But the reason I'm showing this to you is that when you lose weight, the ghrelin levels go up. This is the ghrelin levels with them being heavy. These are ghrelin levels after they lost weight. The other important thing that I'm showing this graph to you is that the ghrelin levels are taking approximately 90 minutes for them to come to their trough levels, to come to their nadir, to their lowest point. So after they peak, they don't come down within like 20, 30 minutes. It can take up to 60 to 90 minutes for them to come down. So your hunger stimulus, the reason why we overeat is because our biology is designed to make us overeat. Now, when you do gastric bypass surgery, you remove a portion of the stomach that's making ghrelin. So these are people who went through gastric bypass surgery. The ghrelin levels were very low, which is what you would expect. But before you say, hey, I want to conquer my hunger by going and getting gastric bypass surgery, I want you to think twice because stomach is very important for our health for many different reasons. And one of the reasons here is that the ghrelin is making, so this is ghrelin levels here in the solid line, and these are growth hormone levels. The rise in ghrelin stimulates growth hormone release, which is very important for our health. So I have spent about 30 minutes talking to you about why calorie restriction is important. I've spent a few minutes of those talking about the biology of hunger, what makes us hunger, how long would we be hungry for. And now I'm getting on to a little bit of uncharted territory because this is not my expertise. But I have counseled patients a lot, and I've been practicing the skill for about 7 years in counseling and on myself. So I think that I understand partially the habits and the behavior and how to modulate it. So not only do I want to tell you that calorie restriction is important and how it helps, not only do I want to tell you what the biology of hunger is, but I want to give you techniques and tricks on how to eat less. So in order to do that, I want to use the work of James Clear. Now, I've read many books on habit formation. Charles Duhigg wrote a book called The Power of Habit, which I read from cover to cover. And I have heard James Clear, and I have read this book of his from cover to cover as well. And what Mr. Clear says is that a habit has 4 different components. There's a cue that leads to a craving, that creates a certain behavior, which is response, that leads to gratification or reward. So let's take these 4 aspects that are driving our food intake and apply them to food. So the cue is the sight, smell, and thought of food. The craving comes when you see that cue. The cue is what is leading to this craving inside your brain saying that, hey, I want to eat. And that craving is happening because your ghrelin levels are going out of control. The response is the act of eating, and the reward is the gratification that you get from eating that food. So this is a loop. It feeds on itself. The cue leads to craving, leads to a response, leads to a reward. And this behavior is repeated because it's creating gratification. So here is what James Clear says, that if you want to create a good habit, you should make the cue obvious. make it present in your environment. If you want to make the craving of a good habit present, make it attractive. If you want to do that behavior, make it easy and make it satisfying. Now you have to inverse that. So for our purposes, we want to eat less. We don't want to have wrong cravings. We want to make it difficult. We need to have a commitment device that we're going to do intermittent fasting, and I'll explain that in a bit. And we need to make it not satisfying. However, I want to modulate all of this for you to see whether it can help you create some better eating habits. So dealing with cue. One of the first things that I tell is that remove the cue from your environment. If I'm working in my office, I don't want to have food available here. I want it not present. At home, clear your pantry of all the junk food. And even the good food that you're eating, you're going to overeat. So you need to have techniques to avoid that. So keep just the amount of food that you need to eat and don't have more. In other words, make it less available. Spend a substantial amount of time in a place where there is no food available for you so that the practice and act of fasting becomes easier. It's very difficult in our environment. What about craving? How do you deal with craving, which is the second aspect of habit formation? We already said eliminate the cues. Knowing that the cue is causing the craving is important. Understanding the biology that ghrelin is leading to that craving for food will help you. Understanding the biology that if you ignore ghrelin for about 20 to 60 minutes, your hunger will go away. So in other words, not like hunger will last forever. If you ignore the craving, the ghrelin will say, I want to take a hike. This person is not listening to me. I'm going to go away. I want to take the example of a Muslim fast. These people fast from sunrise to sunset. At this time, that's nearly 16 hours. They have no food, no water. These people are not fat adapted. They are not on a low-carb diet. The reason they are able to do that is because through cognitive control, they are able to control their craving. And another reason they are able to do that is because this is a group of people who are fasting together for a religious reason. So in other words, I'm trying to plug in my group here. If you join a group that practices fasting, if you join a group that promotes a certain behavior, that behavior can be fostered and it'll be easier for you to stick to that behavior. I'm almost coming to the end. Now, the third law, which is the act of eating, how do you get rid of that? And for that, I want to take the story of Odysseus and the sirens that I got from Goldstein from a TED Talk. And many of us have read about the Odysseus story in high school or junior high. And Odysseus was this big hero who won the war, and he was going back home. And they knew that they were going to pass through this island where there were the sirens. These sirens are these beautiful women that sing an enchanting song. And any sailor that listens to the song will jump out of the ship, go to the shores, and get hit by the rocks and will perish. And Odysseus is telling to his mates that, hey, listen, we're going to tomorrow pass through that island, and I want to listen to that song. And I want to listen but still live. So what I'm going to do is to put ear wax in all your ears so that you can't listen to the song. And he tells the first mate that you're going to tie me to the mast, as shown out here. And as we pass, I'm going to listen to the song, and your job is that no matter what I do, what kind of actions I do, you're not going to untie me so that I will not jump out of the ship and go to the shores and perish. So you would think that for such an important act, like Goldstein is describing, that there would be a rehearsal. So Odysseus gets tied up to the mast and he tells the first mate, I want to go to the sirens, release me, cut me loose. And the first mate wisely does not cut his hands, cut his rope that is tying his hands. And after some time, Odysseus says, I see that you get it. Now let's stop this rehearsal, cut the rope and let's get some supper. And the first mate cuts the rope and Odysseus flips out and says, you idiot, if you do it at that time, all of us will be dead. And so really, what I'm trying to use this analogy for is that this is one of the first descriptions of what is called a commitment device. So in other words, in order not to do that act, you need to have a commitment device. You need to enroll people in helping you. You need to tell yourself that, hey, I'm going to eat less. This is a commitment device that I'm making. So at the time that I have this temptation in front of me, I would be able to resist it. Now let's look at the fourth law very briefly. And the fourth law is make it less satisfying. And that is difficult because humans are wired for immediate gratification. I have a donut in front of me. It is sugary. It's very tasty. It's going to give me immediate gratification to eat it, and not eating it, whether it's a cookie or a donut, will help me in the future. But the future is not here. The temptation is here. The future does not have anything arguing for it, because not eating the cookie will make me perhaps not a diabetic, not obese. And so in the presence of temptation, it gets trounced every single time because humans are wired for immediate gratification. So what I want to do is to give you a strategy. Just to tell you that good habits are not immediately rewarding. Fasting will not improve your health overnight. It may take several weeks. Eating less will not make you lose weight in a day. It may take several months. Calorie restriction will not drop your blood pressure right away. It may take months of practice. So in order for these good habits to be fostered, create an immediate reward. And this is how I want to propose, and this is how I do it. So when I eat less or continue fasting, I make a small deposit in an account. This is my immediate gratification for eating less, so that this behavior is fostered. And over time, I see that this habit be reinforced by the money growing. And for me, it's buying a bicycle. For my friend's daughter that I just mentioned, she may make a pact with her father saying that every time she practices these good habits, that he will deposit $100 in her account. I mean, I'm just making that number up. So this is what I propose, that I want you to consider, with all these techniques that I have told you, to eat when you're eating, to eat when you're up till 70% full. So in other words, I want you to get up from the table when you're hungry. Now, this is going to be very difficult because ghrelin is raging. It's not come down. It's uncomfortable to get up from the table when you're still hungry. But practicing that is knowing that you're doing something good for your health, and also the knowledge that ghrelin takes about 20 to 60 minutes for it to go away. And at times when you're fasting, avoid the cues so that your fasting would be promoted. Use all the knowledge that we have acquired today to deal with cravings. Formulate a commitment device, just like Odysseus did when he was going through the island where the sirens were, so that in the time of temptation, that commitment device will help you not give in. And finally, make eating less and fasting. In other words, getting up, like today, if I get up from the table 70% full and 30% empty, in other words, I get up from the table hungry, I'm going to put $5 in my account to get a new bicycle that'll give me pleasure down the road. So I want to ask myself, did I meet my objectives? The objectives that I laid out today was that, is calorie restriction an important health practice? And I'd like to tell you that it is. I hope that I gave you some idea about the biology of hunger and why we are designed to overeat. And I'm not sure whether I met with the last objective about the practical framework to create a better habit to achieve the goals that I outlined.
Another interesting talk, I thought, Paul, and lots to look into and so on. One point I was interested that I hadn't really thought about was that he said fasting reduces cravings. Is that did I get that right?
Yeah, so it looks like it's relating to the level of ghrelin. So as we know, ghrelin's a hormone that can drive the sensation of hunger and appetite and essentially eating behavior. And as he showed, that with prolonged fasting, ghrelin levels were actually able to be lowered. So it looks very plausible from that fasting can be one method of actually controlling appetite, ironically.
So when we talk about fasting, there's obviously all sorts of different types of fasting. Do we draw a distinction here between sort of a prolonged fast and intermittent fasting, or what's the data show us?
Well, I guess the interesting thing is that for what's considered fasting for a lot of people would only be eating to hunger, depending on the diet you're on. So let me explain. So if somebody was only eating 2 meals a day, that's often what we call having a daily fast. They're obviously skipping one of the traditional 3 meals a day. Whereas in my patients who are consuming ketogenic diets, and if I ask them to only eat when they're hungry, they will very, very often fall into a pattern of only eating twice a day. And from the outside, that looks like they're fasting, but to them, they're just eating when they're hungry. So this there's a little bit of arbitrariness about defining what is fasting and what is not fasting. So I tend to think that fasting, more correctly speaking, should be the deliberate omission of a meal when you actually do have physiological desire to eat. But many people on ketogenic diets reduce their eating frequency, especially when they're in a rapid weight loss phase, when their body's able to draw upon their fat stores for abundant energy. They find that many of these patients will often only eat once a day and they'll be perfectly satiated. And I guess consistent with that, their hunger levels are going to be quite well controlled, which probably does relate back to some of what Nadir has just talked about with ghrelin levels and more prolonged fasting.
If you're only going to eat 1 meal a day, do you have a sort of a preference for when that should be? Do you think it makes a difference?
Look, I don't have a strong preference. I know certain other authorities in the area will recommend that it should be a breakfast meal or an evening meal, but if you're only eating 1 meal a day, I don't think it particularly matters when it is, for my mind. One thing I will note is that in people who are very, very insulin resistant, the diabetics, that there is a tendency for some people to have reactive hypoglycemia. And if that is you, and that basically means that in the hours after a meal, that your blood sugar level will actually crash. If that's happening to you and it's an evening meal, then that will likely lead to sleep disturbance. For that measure, for people very insulin resistant or who suffer reactive hypoglycemia, having your 1 meal of the day in the evening may not make a lot of sense, or you may want to have it earlier in the evening to give time for that to pass.
All right. And 2 meals a day, again, not fussed about when. I mean, I think what a lot of people are doing these days is skipping breakfast and having a sort of a late morning or a lunchtime sort of meal, and then having an early evening meal, getting it into that sort of 6 or 8 hour window. what do you think of that regime?
Oh, look, I mean, we all know that there's potential benefits of time-restricted eating. I guess one of the interesting things to note is that a lot of the metabolic benefits that we have from fasting, so people following the 5-2 diet or so on and so forth, is the same benefits that we see from people on ketogenic diets. So as Nadir pointed out there, that when people go on calorie-restricted diets, we see improvements in their blood glucose, we see improvements in their insulin. And these are both benefits that we also see in ketogenic style diets. So I think that fasting offers more benefit to people who are not eating healthy diets and who have poor sugar levels and who have poor insulin levels. And then I think if you're eating a healthy ketogenic style diet, I think there's far, far less benefit, if any benefit, to be obtained from deliberately depriving yourself of food.